Good morning and good evening, everyone, and no matter where you are in any part of the world, and welcome to the World Responsible Leaders Dialogue. And today that we have some amazing speakers who are here with us, and without further ado, and I like to just have them to introduce themselves, and so maybe start from Dave.
Oh, hello. How do you do? My name is David Nabarro. My role is Professor of Global Health at Imperial College in London. I also run a leadership organization called 4ST in Switzerland, and I'm currently working as COVID envoy for the World Health Organization.
Thank you, Dave. Welcome. And then Annalisa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annalisa Primi. I'm head of structural policy and innovation at the WCD Development Center based in Paris.
Welcome both. And so this is an interesting time, although, global, we are facing global pandemic, and just, before the show, and I checked the data on Johns Hopkins University, and the total confirmed case are over 3 million, and in some countries the case just in one individual country are above 900,000, or some are over 200,000. So the situation in almost all countries are very, very concerning. And I think this conversation is timely in the sense that we want to understand and from experts what's going on and how to just read data, and also what are some of the solutions which we have seen in different parts of the world which are working. And of course that we also want to just have a better understanding of how can we just go beyond this stage, and what are the activities and solutions potentially can help. So maybe in the next 30 minutes, and we'll just have input from or intervention from Dave, and then the next 30 minutes we'll just go to Annalisa. Thank you very much, and I will just now just ask the first question to Dave. Can you help us to understand the scale of this global pandemic, and also how to interpret where we are now?
Thanks very much indeed. What a joy it is to be with you all. I'd like to start by putting it in context, then I'm going to give you my perception of where we are, and then I'm going to spend a few moments on where we might be going to. So it's a new virus, it's a coronavirus. We don't know many coronaviruses, but what we do know about them is that they're really dangerous and difficult viruses to deal with. They're not like flu, and also they're not like actually any other virus. What we know about coronaviruses is that they can be very easily transmitted, they can be extremely dangerous, and they can have a variety of different impacts on the human being. Now, the virus, because it's so easily transmitted, has the capacity, whenever it gets into a community, of quickly forming a very large outbreak. And it tends to be missed at the beginning. You don't quite notice what's going on because only a proportion of those who are infected become seriously ill. In addition, the virus has the capacity to lead to outbreaks that double in size every 2.5 days. It's a kind of exponential spread, which means that an outbreak can increase 1,000 times in 4 weeks, or as much as 10,000 times in 5 weeks. That means that if you are having an outbreak develop, if you don't suppress it immediately, then the challenges for society, and particularly for health services, become really extreme. The societal challenges are that this virus has a really serious impact on older people and people with diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure. And the health service challenge is that you get an awful lot of people coming to hospital, needing care, and that overloads your hospital, and it also overwhelms your health workers. But because this is a disease that spreads in outbreaks, you don't have to reach that position. And one of the reasons why the World Health Organization did not want to call this a pandemic initially was that they wanted everybody to understand that the way in which this disease spreads is through outbreaks that are caused through person-to-person transmission. And the only way that you can prevent the new virus from causing major problems in any society is through using the well-tried and tested approach of interrupting transmission. You find a person who's got the disease, and as soon as you find them, you isolate them, and you don't allow them to be in contact with anybody else for as long as they have the virus. That's usually 14 days. You also find others with whom they've been in contact in the days before they were diagnosed. Usually you go from 2 days before their symptoms started. You find all those contacts, you isolate them as well. And in that way, you stop an individual from forming an outbreak. And we know that any individual with this disease, if they're able to transmit it to others, can start an outbreak. And we know that when outbreaks get big, and as I said, the doubling time is every 2.5 days, so they grow very, very quickly. When outbreaks get big, then stopping them gets hard. And the actions that governments tend to take is they restrict movement and they stop physical contact between people by having lockdowns. Now, in order to get out of this particular acute phase with a lot of lockdowns all over the world, the only solution is to learn to live with this virus as an ever-present threat, to have the capacity to interrupt transmission in every community, to make sure that that capacity is backed up by strong public health services, including the capacity when necessary to restrict movement out of an area to stop the disease spreading. And if that capacity is in place, then life can go on with the constant threat of the virus. And so where we are now is that we are all suddenly waking up to the reality that this is a dangerous new virus. We're all waking up to the reality that we mustn't underestimate it, and that we have to be able to cope with the virus in our midst. We have to adapt the way we behave. We have to adapt the way we do business. We have to adapt the way in which we shield vulnerable people. And we have to adapt our whole styles of leadership to cope with a new reality in our lives. So that's my opening remarks to you, Xiaochen. And the reason why I wanted to stress it like this is I'm trying very hard to get everybody not to say we're going through a pandemic and then we will come back to normal. We're just at the beginning of learning about a new virus that's particularly dangerous. And we're moving to a new reality or a new normal where we're all as a society going to find ways to adapt, to learn to live with it. And it's requiring a lot of rethinking about how we live our lives. But in my last comment now, I want to stress that we've had to change behavior as a result of new viruses before. One of them was the virus that causes the disease AIDS, and that's the HIV. And at the beginning, when it was discovered that HIV was transmitted through sexual intercourse, people were extremely scared of what this would mean for their lifestyles. But we've learned to live and to love with the threat of HIV. Learning to live, socialize, and run our businesses with the threat of COVID is a tougher challenge, but I'm absolutely convinced that humanity is up to the task.
Thank you very much, Dave. And I think, the message that we have to really live in this new reality and then look back and look forward is really the key. And now that, no matter you are in a policy making decision, or you're running your business, or you're living or having your own household, and you find you're really entering into a new phase of your life and your business, and how to live with the new reality. And at the policymaker level, there are so many different type of challenges. There are shortage of PPEs. Then there's the lockdown caused millions of job loss. Then there's also the potential risk. Now all the schools are closed, and then the children, their education, and so many different type of challenge that policymakers are facing. And for you, you're engaged in this international policymaking debate. What are the top priorities in the mind of policymakers as of now?
Thanks very much indeed. I mean, actually, every policymaker finds themselves in a really difficult situation, because they're thinking, I want to try to make sure that the economy restarts. I want to try to make sure that people can get working again. I want to try to make sure that social relations can start, that people can actually go to watch football matches. They also want to be sure that all the essential people are protected. And of course, if you treat this as a succession of discrete policy challenges, and you say we're going to respond to them with a succession of linear interventions, problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. Of course, you're playing catch up all the time, because the very nature of COVID is that by its existence, it simply reveals some of the vulnerabilities and even fragilities in the systems that we have in our societies, whether they are social systems, economic systems, law and order systems. There are vulnerabilities being exposed. And so what I find many policymakers are starting to do is to actually recognize that this is a systems challenge rather than a set of linear challenges. And it requires systems leadership. It requires systems leadership to deal with it, which means being ready to understand that there are multiple interacting forces going on, that they have cascading impacts on different aspects of people's lives, but that you don't just deal with each discrete impact. You try to find the central pivots around these systems are moving and deal with those. So, policymaker essential number one, make sure that people understand what is happening. This is an all of society, all of humanity issue that requires everybody to be able to make sense of it in their different ways at roughly the same time. The policymaker understands that this will inherently be uncomfortable. It will be perplexing. It will provoke anger. It will provoke frustration. We'll need to find people to blame. All those emotions are going through everybody's heads in different ways at this time. And it's not possible to legislate for a collective process of sense-making and behavior change. That has to involve some individual latitude. And so the policymaker needs to be prepared to explain that we're dealing with a complex systems challenge, and also to let people find their own way of coming to terms with it, but do it quickly. And there, I believe that there is a huge need for regular space for people to express their anxieties and concerns, and to have some kind of interpretation without necessarily answers. So I've only got the 3 points here. The first point is people need space and opportunity to make sense of what's happening so that they can work out what they're going to do about it. Secondly, I don't know what this is. Can you call me back in about 20 minutes? I'll try to talk then. I'm sorry, I just can't speak. I'm on a webinar and I'm speaking. So the second thing is the absolute need to get the community-based public health part right. Now, it's not going to be possible to deal with this threat without making sure that we've got the necessary elements in society for finding people with the disease and for helping them to isolate. There's just no alternative. None. And this is really challenging in poorer settings where the capacity to do basic public health is quite limited. And I think that the efforts underway by the World Health Organization and others to really put a lot of emphasis in getting the pieces that are necessary for the health response to where they are required is absolutely essential. Part of me wants this to become the overall priority of every single national leader. This is an issue on which the whole world has to work together. And we can't afford to have people in poorer countries struggling without the bare necessities they need, with the virus advancing and causing all sorts of distress. It will lead to many cascading impacts, including insecurity, including a whole sense of alienation from government, many other quite difficult issues. And so what I'm actually saying to everybody is global solidarity like never before. My third point on the policy side is actually the form of leadership. I did mention systems leadership. I'm actually taking it one stage further. It has to be a form of systems leadership that anticipates where new impacts would come. I think if somebody said to me 4 months ago, when I first started hearing about this virus appearing in Wuhan and all that, if somebody said to me, we're going to have a complete collapse of the global tourism industry in 4 months' time as a result of this virus, I would have found it really hard to anticipate, but I think I could have. If somebody had said to me, there's going to be widespread problems in prisons and other detention facilities because of anxiety among the prisoners and concerns among the staff, I think I might have just started thinking about it. But goodness me, it would have been so much better if collectively, as we were thinking through where this might lead to, there had been a much more intensive anticipation of the likely systems consequences now from what was happening then. And the same applies now. As this challenge is advancing massively across the world, we need to have leadership that anticipates future systems impacts. We need to have leadership that articulates the meaning that this has in different settings. We need to not be secretive and restrictive about it. We need to talk and we need to share so that our sense making is clear to others. We need to have leadership that adapts, because there are constant principles for what we've got to do, but they vary hugely in different venues. And the current state in Western Europe of coming to terms with this virus is people are now really realizing how beastly and serious it is. But in other parts of the world, people are still beginning to get to that point. So, and adaptation is key. And the last thing is that on every decision and action we make, because we are working with the collective behavior of 7.8 billion people, each one of us in public policy on everything we do has to recognize that we have an accountability, whether it's a visible accountability or not. We need to be thinking at all times, for every decision I make, am I doing it for the public good or for some private good? Am I actually working for the benefit of humanity, or am I working to enable a select group have an easy chance and others have to struggle? And I think that value-driven accountability is absolutely key. So those are my sort of watchwords, and I go back to you. But just to say what I stressed at the beginning, it's everybody's business, so we have to get everybody on board. It is about public health, but it's about public health in a very basic and community level way. And there is a form of leadership now, systems leadership, which is a combination of anticipation, articulation, adaptation, and accounting. Those are, I believe, increasingly the watchwords that every leader has to have in their front as well as their back of the brain, and in their heart and in their soul.
Yeah, and I think you provide a very nice and very clear framework that all leaders as of now should just look at, from recognizing, the emotional stress that it could cause to everybody, and then really take care of people's emotion. And of course, it's, healthcare, and you also need to take care of people's health. And with the forward-looking kind of decision-making process, that you also take off of people's future. So with all different type of measure. I think this is a very nice framework that's all that could be really useful for all leaders. And for in the past few months, that we also just set up a FinTech for Good COVID-19 task force, where we started. One program was to matching PPE supplies with demand, but we really find out it's without technology it's hard. And this factory claims that we have this certificate. Then you go to you try to verify that, and then that information is not there. And then how do you verify that this has the right certificate needed? Then there's the lockdown, and now open up all the concerns from the business and the schools and all that, or how can we make sure that we are not exposed to the virus, to the potential risk, while we still just have that intimacy to just have face-to-face experience. And here that I think there's a lot of space where technology can play. And in your view, that's what type of role can technology help to solve this problem, or to help no matter at the policy level or at the unit level, and what the role does technology play?
Thanks very much indeed. Well, I think that the first point is connectivity. In dealing with this issue, if we are anticipating widespread behavior change based on a mindset shift and sense making that has to precede it, I actually do think that being able to connect is key. And so the first step is voice. And when I talk to phone operators, they say, shouldn't we be focusing on data? I say, yep. But what people most want to do is to hear each other speak, and to speak to each other, either individually or collectively. So paying attention to voice should not be underestimated. Sometimes it's simple things like having the opportunity for people to phone in questions to radio chat shows. I got a colleague working in Somalia who said that the most important thing for people in Somalia, as they're trying to make sense of this, was simply having a number to ring where there was a kind of a chat show jockey who was simply receiving questions and then encouraging dialogue between listeners, sometimes keeping 2 or 3 listeners online at the same time. And of course, there was all sorts of stuff that one might say was strange and peculiar coming out. But it's this sense-making process is so important. And I think for many people, voice is still important. And for an awful lot of people, actually having voice contact is still very, very expensive. So I would say number 1, voice. Number 2 is data. Yes, people need to be able to connect and to be able to share data. And that means also that they can ideally share images, and they can do things like what we're doing now. That's absolutely key. And so I just don't know how I'm going to deal with this. Sorry, it's a second call. So I want to be clear that the dealing with all these different forms of communication is the key. And so I'd make my second point. And thirdly, I do think that apps are important. Apps to help with the whole process of knowing where you are in relation to other people who've got COVID symptoms. Apps in relation to knowing what you should do if you've got COVID symptoms. There are a lot of platforms being developed. Apps in relation to knowing where different things are to improve distribution. You just referred to PPE, but we've got a whole series of new apps coming for farmers who've got food rotting in their fields and want to tell urban people who need food, come here and pick up food, otherwise it's going to be wasted. There's all sorts of new ways in which technology can short circuit very complex supply chains and can improve the flow. So just to make it really, really clear to everybody, at each stage of the work that we're into at the moment, tech is critical, but we have to have at the center the points that you just actually played back to me. This is about people, their emotions, their ability to shift mindsets and make sense of things. So the tech needs to help with that. This is about health systems, about supply failures, about market failures, and it's about food systems, and it's about law and order systems. So we need tech to help make sure that these systems work well. And then thirdly, it's about leadership. And you do need tech for leadership. Yes, you need models, but don't let the models dictate policy. Policy depends on the sharing of experience and results, and then feeding those results into models with all the care that we have to have when it comes to modeling. So we need sharing for effective systems leadership. And with that, Xiaochen, I know it's really rude, but I'm actually just going to say bye-bye, because I'm finding it difficult to manage my time. But I'm so grateful to you for the chance to interact, and I love exchanging with you. I love what FinTech for Good is doing, and I hope Annalisa will forgive me. My colleague Joe Colombano, who's the clever one in our team, he knows the economics, he's staying on this call and will be participating in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave, and good luck for your busy, and I really appreciate that you stay with us for the for your busy schedule. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. We will put here just on the chat, we do provide narratives, Joe and I and others, and we will put the web address for the narratives just in case folk are interesting. And the one on the 4 A's, that's about to go up as well. Thank you very much. And Annalisa, it's gorgeous to see you. Thank you for all you're doing and for all the OECD is doing. And really impressed that you're on this. And what I read on the OECD website is marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Bye.
Thank you.
So, and I think, although it's only a 30 minutes conversation, but definitely it's rich, and there are a lot, and I think at least from that conversation that we have a number of interesting points. One is that we do need to have a better framework to understand, to interpret what's going on. And I think, Dave provides, one of those very important tools to looking at it. Then, for policymakers, and there are quite a number of things which are useful to just in terms of, how to just set a priority right, and also how to take care of people. And, for you, that's probably before we just, go to the specific question, and maybe you can just also share a little bit with us about your work, and what because the OECD is doing a lot of amazing work, and specifically for your development center, and what's your main focus?
Thank you, Xiaochen, and great to be here with you and with the friends online. Well, I think when I was listening to David, he really mentioned things that we were working on. He mentioned three important words: anticipate, adapt, and have a mechanism for collective accountability, for collective behavior. And actually, we do review country strategies for production transformation. We were doing this before the COVID crisis, and we will continue to. And actually, we have a 5-pillar framework in which we were calling for governments and policymakers actually to strengthen their anticipation capacity. This is our first pillar. The second pillar is adaptation capacity. So we were kind of advising governments probably in the right way. And we have 3 additional pillars that are very much in line with what he said. And I'm curious to see how we can adapt our framework using his expression of accountability of collective behavior, which I really like, which is the fact we say governments need to support the capacity to learn. We are living unprecedented circumstances. Governments are learning a lot, and I'll say something about it later. So this is an important pillar of effective strategy, not only pointing to innovate, but to support learning processes in production and industrial systems. And also the capacity to work in network, this issue of collectivity, and it's not only about industries connected, but it's people, and through their behavior, they're generating inputs. And we always call for, in his words, this would be a kind of value-driven approach. We said that we need policies that are able to deliver results to the society and the place in which people live. So I think we have a framework, and we do work that is very much in line. I think it was useful before. It's probably even more useful now. Our governments are trying to make sense of how to do this.
Yeah, and I think this is really nicely, connected to conversation, and this framework, you have, maybe later you can also share the link, and I see that Joe already shared the link, and from the full SD side, and I think OECD is this anticipation, adaptation, and it's really at the right time. And my second question to you is really trying to just understand the dynamic between the developed and the developing, and because we all know that the global pandemic is impacting all countries. And of course that, as if we take your adaptation framework to look at it, the adaptation ability of, different countries are different. So then, probably that's, can you just share with us how does the COVID-19 potentially impact the developing countries?
Okay, yeah, well, thank you. You're right. That's impacting everybody in a very different way. In my answers, I'll try to focus on Africa and Latin America. These are the two areas in which we are mostly working now. Of course, we work on Asia, but I have more recent data on Africa and Latin America. Well, let's say that just to put on something positive, if you look at the developing countries, the pandemic arrived a little bit later. There is a kind of three waves. There was Asia, Europe, North America, and this is happening now in the developing countries, Africa and Latin America. So at least there is possibility, if governments are wise enough, to learn from the responses of other countries. We see this in Africa, for example, the countries restricted travel much before than in other areas. So there has been like an activation in the response a little bit earlier, which can be a positive element. There is, in the case of Africa, for example, particularly, there is a demographic structure that could help. There is a relatively younger population in the continent, and there is a certain level of preparedness of facing precedent pandemic. Think about the Ebola in 2014. For us in Europe, like this was like, we were really not prepared. Nobody thought that our world could be totally changed. But unfortunately, in other areas of the world, there is a level of preparedness and of reaction, even in the government, but also in the society. However, even if we consider this, risks are much higher. And on this, I totally agree with David, and risk is higher, both on the health emergency side, but also on the consequent economic crisis. So on the health side, of course, this pandemic arrives in countries in Latin America and Africa that were already facing development challenges. If you look at Africa, 60% of the poorest people live in Africa. The pandemic is hitting a continent with these characteristics. And the pandemic is also augmenting and amplifying certain structural weaknesses of developing countries. And I would say, for example, on the healthcare systems, the challenge on the health emergency, healthcare systems are very weak, not only in terms of coverage, but also in terms of the physical capacities of hospital. 0.3 beds per 1,000 people in Senegal versus 8.3 in Germany. So the capacity of the system to respond, even under normal circumstances, is much below what is needed. So imagine in the pandemic, affordable access to drugs, to medical supplies, and to vaccine when this will be available. Our friends in the Economic Commission for Africa of the United Nations, Stephen Karinji, Lily Sommer, and his team, they estimated that 94% of medical supplies in Africa are imported, and they are imported by countries that are actually now hit by the pandemic and that are facing challenges in providing their domestic market. So the developing countries are under a big challenge. In terms of economy, there are trickle-down effects, partly because of containment measures. Containment measures are much more costly in terms of economy and society in developing countries. Consider that 70% of the workforce in developing emerging economies is informal. It's very difficult to afford to be in lockdown if you are an informal worker. And also, it's very complex on economic point of view, because this economy were highly dependent on trade with advanced countries. I'll make you an example. In the case of, for example, we're working with Dominican Republic now. In the country, remittances are even more important than foreign direct investment. The remittances comes mostly from their diaspora in the US. This flow is probably going to be severely hidden in the future. So countries will have challenges in terms of accessing foreign exchange. The countries that are exporting natural resources, for Chile, for Colombia, Chile, 50% of their exports are in the copper. Most of it is demanded by China. We see an interruption and a disruption in supply chain in that side. So those are big issues. And of course, the limited fiscal capacities of government to step in and support those who are hit the most in this, on the health side, but also on the economy side. Imagine in the first fiscal package that Italy announced for rescue, for addressing the COVID emergency, is kind of the GDP of Argentina. So mobilizing this kind of resources in developing countries is difficult.
Yeah, and so I think this is really a very important summary of the different aspects of vulnerabilities, and using Dave's framework, say good leaders, you need really just say steps or 10 steps ahead. And I think what you have just discussed really show the international development community that we need to do something much earlier before it is too late. In terms, when you just shared all the aspects, from the SMEs, from the trading side and the job loss side, and from also the potential supply shortage of PPE supply, and also other medical service and all that. And what can international development community start doing now to just really hopefully just deliver those kind of support before it's too late?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, two points on this. The international community likely now is starting to think of what could be done for developing economies. At the beginning, there was a lot of inward reaction to think about what can we do, each one for his own country. On this, I totally share David's point. Global solidarity as never before. This is really the landmark also of what we are advocating. The recent G20 declaration in terms of debt relief on the poorest country is a step, but of course this is really not enough. So I would say on this that what we are saying, at least in analyzing, for example, trade, manufacturing, and intellectual property responses on this, we actually think that it's very, very important to act on the testing in developing countries, so enable testing and identifying and tracing the patients and their contacts, because lockdown measures will need to be eased much sooner than what advanced countries are able to support. And we also support a lot of global cooperation in research. And an important point I want to make on the intellectual property, because I think that there are two areas in which we need a major innovation in the approach that we have been seeing. On the one hand is a change in behavior. We are used to see a rush for innovation and competition for innovation, but in the case of developing and manufacturing the testing kits and identifying drug treatments and vaccine, global cooperation is needed. So of course you want to have multiple efforts. You don't know what is going to work, but we also would like that the first important good solution could be scaled up. So you need cooperation, you need everybody, you need the pharmas, but you also need the biotech. I think that people that are more expert than I am on the healthcare sector would say you also need the doctors, you need the people and the hospital managers, you need the people that understand how things happen on the ground to develop the right medical solution. So you really need in terms of facilitating cooperation much more. And another point in which I think global solidarity is of absolute importance is a change in the intellectual property management, because access needs to be granted to, in an affordable way, to all the solution as soon as possible. So for the vaccine, we know the vaccine will take time to be developed, but once it's developed, there could be shortages in manufacturing capacity. It's not only to find it, test it, and get it approved. It is get it approved on a global level. We don't have global standards for this. And there is a need to be able to manufacture it, and that to get it where is needed, and to get it at a price that is affordable. So for this, there is a need for a global agreement on lifting intellectual property protection on COVID-related medical supplies. We are calling for this from at least my team in the Development Center. We cannot say this is, we have not discussed this with all the groups in the OECD that of course work on those issues, but at least this is our position. We worked with the Economic Commission for Africa. We have actually a paper that we prepared, we can share later, discussing this issue. We think it's particularly important. Global agreements allow for lifting and excluding, for example, medical IP protection under national emergencies circumstances. This is a global pandemic. We do need a global agreement on this. It's very costly to do it country by country. Germany, Israel, Canada, they have already issued bills that allow, for example, for compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing and parallel imports will be important for Africa, will be important for Latin America, and they do have manufacturing poles that can develop the solution, but they will need to be allowed to do so legally, but also with business capabilities. So we need lifting the IP and also setting up mechanisms so that the manufacturing sites can be ready to manufacture when this will be needed. Otherwise, the risk is that you will have a very big monopoly or one provider that can discriminate access.
Yeah, and I think this is a very important point because a lot of efforts as of now in terms of the innovation is all around the supply side. But actually, they're at the policy side rather, than to just look at who can supply, but also really get the IP policy right to have, this policy framework ready to allow or enable collaboration. I think that's, the key. And this actually also just, partially addressed my next question. And as, OECD not only provide very important framework data, for global, analysis, but also, serves as a hub to, surfacing the solutions for different, area for development. So now have you seen some of the tested or the most effective policy and also technical solutions which are being used in some countries, which might have the influence to be, amplified and scaled up in other countries?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Well, on the solutions, 2 points on the business side and on the government side. On the business side, we've been seeing lots of changes. Businesses are innovating because this pandemic is creating a liquidity shortage. It's limiting investment, so companies are stressed. There are no reasons, but it's also true that the pandemic and the crisis, they do mobilize two powerful innovation drivers because it mobilizes demand. There are new demands, so this is a big push for innovation. Consider the increase in the demand for food and the kind of service delivery in terms of data streaming industries for the entertainment. So there is a growing demand. On the other hand, there are challenges. There are things that need to be fixed. The private sector is being called to address this. The private sector is really navigating uncharted territories on this because they have to learn how to operate with restrictions, with consumers that are afraid. I think the social dimension that David highlighted, it's very important. This is really changing how do we perceive, and so even how do we behave as consumer and part of the society is changing. I think there are examples that are very interesting from, for example, industries that are being reconfigured, but that they're not facing a big challenge for now. Let's consider the agri-food. We're not entering. There are some are raising red flags about there could be like a shortage in the cats and the flu of food, but for now this is a business that has just seen a major increase in demand, and that change in who demands what. For example, in France, all the producers of water that they were used to produce all these very small, very polluting small bottles, plastic bottles to deliver to the restaurants or the offices and all the traditional distribution chain. This is gone, so they have to shift to a production for the big bottles for the supermarkets. But in that industry, we're seeing interesting changes. For example, Danone created a new liquidity fund to support their suppliers that are in need. So what we see is that certain actors from the private sector can step in to alleviate a little bit the burden on the government in supporting the most fragile, when, for example, they're acting as responsible actors in their supply chain. Danone in France, this is the example I just mentioned. It was very interesting. It's the Rana, the pasta maker that makes the tortellini. They increased the salary of their workers 25%. They have to have the workers to go to work. So, incentives are needed. So salary increase on 25%, vouchers for babysitters, and extended health coverage. So there are big things happening in the organization of businesses that can be maybe expanded in other industries that are seeing upsurges. I'm thinking of the big winners of this, like the big tech companies or credit cards. The areas in which we are seeing a lot of increase in demand. In terms of policy innovation, well, we could say first that maybe governments haven't innovated as much, because if you look at the lockdown measures, these we can trace back to the Middle Ages in Venice. Government partnering with industry to support that production is increased, to facilitate industrial reconstructions, to give cash to enable companies to continue operate. This sounds a lot like the war type of industry-government relationship. And even the IP issues that I mentioned, that these are not so much innovations, because this is actually foreseen under the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement and the Doha Declaration. However, when you go and look at very specific issues and when you try to see what governments are doing, then we can see that there have been innovations. And I want to mention just three, because I think they're positive innovation that can help us in the transition and in the future. One is the issue that governments take a crash course in governing the market. And this is, so we were coming from decades in which there was a soft power, governments, better if they don't interfere too much in the markets can self-regulate, it's global, so there is not so much even to do at the national level. And all of a sudden, we have this strong government that they have to enter into our spheres of life as private as you can go out to your house or not. You can open your business or not, even though you have a license. And all of a sudden, they have to deal with all these specificities in their territory. So it's not about the global policy, it's about what is happening in that little village, in that region. Because remember that this pandemic, it's not national. This thing happens where people are. So this is really about cities and villages and where actually people live. So I think that this is showing us that we do need competent governments. The governments had learned again and relearn that they need to talk with the society. And this is a point that David made too, also from another point of view. So learning to talk with the society, it's not only to reassure them, it's because if you want to nudge certain behavior, because at least we cannot impose, even if we issue bills, you want to convince people, you have to learn to talk to them, you have to talk to the businesses. Because so all this dialogue and interaction, this has been a major learning, very, very rapid, that required the major government reorganizations. And maybe this can leave us with better routines and strengthened government. So governments more capable to do what they should be doing, which is governing the market and the society in the global public interest. So I would say that this is one first point. The second is something that we had an interesting governing board meeting of the Development Center yesterday, and Brazil made a very interesting point about governments had to learn to identify the fragile people in the system. Because if you want to help them, you need to identify them. And this cannot be taken for granted. Because there are a lot of citizens in developing countries that they are invisible. Because they operate in the informal market, because you're not getting services, they're under the surface. And I think this is also teaching us, for example, we learned how to support the poor. There were very important cash transfer programs, like in an analysis that I did some years ago about the Bolsa Familia program that I've been always very supportive of, is that it was actually acting as a revealer of citizens. So you want to help the super poor, you have to first find them, then you see where they are, you identify them, and then you need to give them services. So Brazil created, for example, a unique registry. So they were not only getting the cash transfer, conditionality was you have to go to school and you have to provide healthcare to your kids. Well, then you need to have a school to go to, and you have to have an hospital. So you reveal needs. But what happens with the informal people, with those that are in the gray part of the economy? You don't see them. We're not seeing them. We cannot help them. And this is something important. Brazil and South Africa are actually ahead of other countries in trying to identify those people and create safety nets. So I think this is a second very important in the policy innovation area. And the third point, it's the most obvious, but I think it's still worth recalling, which is the fast tracking of digitalization in policy making. So, and this has required adjustment on all fronts, even in areas of policies that are different from the one that we would think about. So of course there is the issue of what kinds of rules do you need to enable e-medicine, for example, but also privacy issues. Where do you put the balance between the fact that you want to allow people to protect their privacy rights, and on the other end, you need to trace people if you really want to limit contagion and maybe get healthy people outside and not keep all of a country inside. And also, countries innovated in terms of fast tracking a lot digitalizations, breaking barriers. Sometimes a good technology is not adopted, not because it's not good, but because we have resistances in adapting to novelty. I like a lot a paper by Paul David, The Economics of QWERTY, where he explains why the keyboards, they have the order of the letters in the way it is now, even if engineers explained this was really not the best organization. It's just that once they started like this, there is inertia. And I think that a major thing that this pandemic caused is that it broke down certain routine and inertia. And countries have introduced rules, for example, fast-tracking digitalization in trade for facilitating imports and exports of medical supplies. This has happened Brazil, but also Dominican Republic. This has happened in many African countries. So these are three key things I think countries have innovated into that are actually very positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, that when I was just listening to your 3 points, it's interesting that it's all about government ability, reinventing your ability, how to reach your community. If you have a federal level of policy, how can you at the community level that policy can be really communicated properly to the community, and then open up the community and enable the community to just have the access and all that. And the digitalization is actually a way to enable that. And this also just go to my next question. And then crisis also create opportunities. And you mentioned that from policy innovation side is already accelerated, the digitalization related policy process and introduce the new tools there. And I want you to just spend a little time to talk about how digitalization or digital innovation are enabled through this global pandemic.
Yeah, well, digitalization are very, very big, important, major linkages with this pandemic. Before I answer to you, because I think we sent people to have a question, I see a friend, Sri Ramaya. Hi. She asked a question about unlocking international trade. If I had the answer, I would be a super international consultant. No, I think that one of the things that we are working on in my team in the development center and with our partners in Africa, but also in Latin America, is to look at the regional trade. I think you need to start from what people want and what are the basic needs at the beginning and then see. So one issue is to see how we can unlock regional trade and how we can improve the rules that exist now to at least enable manufacturing in poles for example, in Latin America and in Africa, and then revamp and probably adapt agreements so that international regional trade can be developed. And then maybe with the time see how the international dimension could work. But this can actually be very good for developing countries, and for at least in Latin America, where the regional integration agenda has been a bit lagging behind, and Africa just signed some months ago the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This provides an umbrella. It's important not to stop that, but to use this as an opportunity. And Xiaochen, to go to your question, the digital, I mean, what we see is that there has been a major issue. I mean, the fact that consumers have shifted basically online for the few consumption that is possible. The fact that the telework widespread, I think this is something that I'm not so sure as a consumer. I think we have to introduce a gender issue in the analysis. No average consumer. So as a woman, I just want to go back to the shops. Maybe if you ask my husband in the other room, I'm perfectly fine. We just reduce all the things that we buy and we just stop. But I think that still we need, maybe we will have some rebound on the retail aspect. But I think that on the shift towards digitalization in terms of the workplace, this will have major lasting impacts. Even though we are seeing, I was reading some news about the fact that people are starting to get stressed about telework and the fact that people miss the office dimension, that's for sure. But it's also true that big companies reorganize processes and learned that they can do things differently. So there, I think it's a whole reorganization. We can actually rethink how we organize our capitalist system. Do we need people to commute for 3 hours to go to the office every day? Is this really good for them, for the planet? It's really an opportunity to think of how digital can make our life better, and not only be like a rescue industry in a moment in which nothing else is possible. I think there we need thinkers, and maybe you also have views on how this can be done. I think reversing the trend is going to be very difficult because we get used to this, and I share the views of David that we will be with this for a long time. So the changes get rooted into people, and then we change habits too. I think it's important that when we think about digitalization, and if we bring the dimension of developing and developed countries, we have to consider that two things. One, the fast tracking of digitalization should be managed in a way that we keep space open for a lot of actors. There is a big risk of concentration. When we were discussing the digital economy before this pandemic, we were already warning about we have to preserve competition in the industry. We want different players to be there. So this is something that we will have to watch, because you want innovators and you want new actors. On the other hand, not all economies and people can benefit in the same way from digitalization yet. There are major gaps, for example, in internet infrastructure when you look at developing countries. We were doing some analysis, and a colleague found this data, which I always quote because I always forget the numbers, so I need to read them, but I always find them interesting. Like that in Congo, for the same movie that you want to download in Africa, in one country, in Congo, it takes almost 1 day, 23 hours. And in Singapore, the same movie, it's 20 minutes. So the impact is very different according to the type of service and the type of infrastructure. So digitalization is not yet equal for everybody, and this is an agenda for government and for public policy together with the private sector. If you think about the industry dimension, you want firms to be able to operate in networks. We still hope that we will have economies with more local production, but we also want regional trade. We do want international trade. So if you want to operate in digitalized production systems, you cannot have a lot of disparity, because if you want to have your suppliers, for example, managed through the internet, you cannot have one supplier. For example, in Colombia, the share of high-speed connection is 2.2% of the total connections, 70% in the Republic of South Korea. So how really and who is really benefiting of this, it really depends on where you are still geographically. So we have an important agenda there to make digitalization really work for all.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because you mentioned this is probably the beginning of think how to use digitalization to redesign our society, redesign our organization. This is really only the beginning. And of course, we already seeing, a lot of actions on the ground, and then, to how to just really take those actions and understand them, surfacing them, and then finally to filter some and then bring that back to this holistic redesign process would be really, really interesting. And it's already 4 minutes after our show, and I want you to just probably say, what is your take? We have covered many ground. So what is your takeaway message you want our audience to in short? Yeah.
Well, first, thank you for organizing this. I learned a lot, so it's been very interesting. Takeaway is difficult. I just think, I was reading this interview about one of these old guys that was in the project of designing the internet connection. And if you remember, when we shifted to the digital, there was all this, oh my God, the internet is not going to work. The network is not strong enough. Everybody's shifting, and then the network will collapse. And at the end of the day, the network didn't collapse, and we are all connected. We experienced a little bit of it, but maybe because we are not so good at it, but it's working. And when they asked the guy why, he said, well, because we built the network resilient, redundant, and safe. And maybe we can take inspiration from there. I think the economies, they have to be governed and managed and built in a way that they are resilient, redundant, and safe. So this means we have to have plans B. To go back to the words that we said, I think it's very important, this anticipation capacity. We have been living in too much forgetting that there could be a problem. So I think that learning from this experience that there could be challenges, and if we are a little bit more prepared, then we can limit the damage. And I think that's something we're learning now, and we can use this for the future and for the future generations. There's so many agendas. The climate change, making our world a better world is possible. And maybe this is a call for redefining a bit our values.
Yeah, and so thank you very much. Do you still have 1 or 2 minutes to just looking at the two questions we have? One is around revisit the SDG 17 goals. Do we, can we do that? Do we need to do that? And the second question is about article recommendation of the IP issues that you talked about.
Okay. Well, on the SDGs, it took so much to agree on all the SDGs and all the targets that I think they actually provide. Maybe this situation can help to advance, because the goals were actually, you can criticize from many aspects, but at the end of the day, if we manage to shift production, consumption, and trade, which was the big add to the SDG with respect to the Millennium Development Goals, I think that would be important. So I think that we can guide our actions and government and business action to that lenses. It's just that maybe we should do it faster and on all fronts. The systemic approach we mentioned at the beginning of this hour is important. It's not going goal by goal. It's to look at what happens when you change the system. So it's a little bit more radical, but the ingredients, I think they're all there. To look on the IP issue, there are lots of things. We can share with you this note that we just released on what trade, manufacturing, and intellectual property can do for fast tracking the Africa response to the COVID, in which we make a super synthesis on IP issues and what could be done. And then if not, there was a recent article by Joe Stiglitz in Project Syndicate yesterday, and there is lots of work. I think a lot of the work that we did in the, let's say 10 years ago, around 2008, 2009, where the development agenda on IP was high, is probably a good source of inspiration. And I can share more bilateral if needed.
Perfect. So really, thank you very much. And for those links, and you can share with me, and I can share with everyone. If it's easy, you can post it here. If not, you can share with me. I will send an email.
I'm able to do it.
Exactly. Yeah, I will just send them later. But I think this is such an amazing conversation. I had so much fun. And this is not only about we did cover a lot of ground here, but also that this positive note that we can just see we are, although everyone suffer from the pandemic, no matter we talk about the economy, we talk about our health, we talk about our social interaction, everyone suffered. But in the meantime, it is an opportunity that we have an opportunity just to sit down or slow down and also just look at what do we want as humanity and how we can just leverage technology to design a new organizational structure, to come up with new solutions, to make really our world a better place. So with that, and again, thank you very much for Annalisa's great contribution to this, and we'll have our next show next week, and I will just send everyone the link to the next show. And for this show, that if you want to watch the recording, it's the same address. Go to this address, and everything is recorded, and you can just go back to just to any points which inspire you. And thank you very much, Annalisa. And of course, that I will also thank you, Dave and Joe, to be here. And that's a fascinating conversation, and I hope that everyone enjoyed it. And no matter where you are, and please stay safe and stay healthy and stay positive. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, everybody. Thank you, Xiaochen. We will.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.